Okay, so welcome to the second webinar of the new critical approaches to the Byzantine World Torch Research Network. The topic of this webinar is Subalternity and Byzantine Studies, with the subtitle Critically Imagining the Masses in History, which I'll come to in a second. I'm Matheou. I'm a comparative social historian based at the Institute for Historical Research in London and specialising in medieval Anatolia, Upper Mesopotamia. And the reason why I've chosen subalternity in particular for this second webinar, just make sure I know the time so I don't go over. For this second webinar is because subaltern is probably the most widely used technical term for oppressed, dominated, or persons or social categories in the contemporary social and human sciences, which reflects the hegemonic position of the sort of broad literature known as post-colonialism in the critical humanities. And by that I mean that post-colonialism is the reference point for people who are seeking to be critical and to write politically informed humanities research at the moment, and probably for the last 2 decades or so. And I think in this context then it's important to understand the genealogy of the term and concretize what's meant by other alternatives like proletariat historically, or producers, or commoners or lower classes, what we actually mean by subaltern specifically, because otherwise there's this ever-present danger that tends to happen when a critical direction becomes hegemonic, that people adopt the terms but in increasingly common sense ways, and we lose its specificity as a technical term. And the point of this seminar with regards to Byzantine studies is to begin exploring how we can better equip ourselves to what I term critically imagine the masses in the medieval empire, which is a phrase that's meant to articulate a sort of basic methodological problem that we have with the materials we're using to construct our images of the period, which you can broadly define as one of access, which is access is part of the problematics for the contemporary debate on subalternity, but with slightly different emphases to perhaps the way that we'd look at it, simply a problem of sources or evidence, so to speak. So I could sort of sum up the problem as subaltern actors made the world go round, but they're mostly invisible in our material, or at least the way in which we're trying to look at our material. So how can we assert their existence and represent this fundamental role whilst being aware of the limitations? And I think ultimately here the political takeaway is the pitfalls of positivist empiricism, this valorization of having to have a kind of direct access. So that's the sort of problem. So I'll start to give a genealogy that'll go through Gramsci and the way in which subaltern was outlined in Antonio Gramsci. Then I'll go into subaltern studies and give a little outline of subaltern studies and give a little outline of how it's developed in subaltern studies, and end with some thoughts of the project of James Scott, which sort of interestingly intersects with both the Gramscian approach to the subaltern and the subaltern studies problematics, and end with some thoughts and kind of how this might play out in Byzantine studies. These problematics are reflected in Byzantine studies, both as a discipline and in terms of a sort of mode of historical inquiry. So the genealogy of the word subaltern begins with communist militant Antonio Gramsci in his prison notebooks, which were written over a 6-year period from 1929 to 1935, broadly from when he was permitted writing materials by the fascist prison regime that he was living under, up to when his health stopped him from being able to work in 1935, and he died from these health complications 2 years later. And in that period from 29 to 35, he finished around 32 different notebooks on a wide range of topics, from the structure of American capitalism under the influence of Henry Ford's Taylorist production, to the more famous issues of cultural hegemony and how political consent is states, and then a wide-ranging other set of topics as well. And the notebooks are a huge issue in and of themselves, so I won't dwell on them, but it's important to note a few things in general about the notebooks which touch on how we use the sections relevant to subalternity. One is that obviously they're notebooks, they're finity. One is that obviously they're notebooks, they're fragmentary, and they'll resist any attempt to distill a pure, internally consistent and externally coherent sort of theory. Not that this has stopped people from trying to do this, not least those people who call themselves the Gramscians. The second is that the language is often really difficult to sort of relate to the broader terms that were being used in Marxist theory at the time. For instance, he never even uses the word Marxism or historical materialism. He uses this word philosophy of practice. Originally this was always thought to be a code so that he could avoid fascist censors. But as a code, it's not a very effective one. For instance, his term for Lenin was Ilich, which is just Lenin's patronymic. It's not a very good code. So now there's more awareness that actually he might be attempting to do particular things with these terms and rethink some of the core concepts of Marxism. And I really think that's the way that we should go with it, because as a code, it's pretty terrible. And the third thing is just is a problem in terms of access. That in Anglophone scholarship, there's never been a fully translated, edited edition of the notebooks. Someone called Joseph Buttigieg started this process, but has died before he's completed it. And so this means that, for instance, Notebook 25 is entirely about subaltern social categories, but it's never appeared in English in its entirety. There's categories, but it's never appeared in English in its entirety. There's going to be a posthumous publication of Notebook 25 in September. But by and large, still, in English, the access is through Quentin Hawes to collections of the 70s. So I think those are really important when we think about how Gramsci's been used. So to move more to the concept subaltern, as I said, there's a whole notebook dedicated to subaltern social classes, but it also appears in a number of different contexts. And the main thing is that it appears as a hugely broad category for any kind of dominated or exploited social category or set of people. So it basically just means subordinate in the broadest sense, and sometimes it gets actually just translated as subordinate. But it also seems to have, in some instances, specific applications. So it often appears as a set of dialectical couplets alongside others. So you get hegemony and subalternity, force and consent, active and passive, all dialectical concepts that are used in Gramsci's thought, in explicit opposition to the Marxist versions of determinist or positivist thought that would see social transformation happening through linear chains of causation. And I think a key thing to say about Gramsci's use of the subaltern is that there's no need, or it would be impossible to try and do some kind of return to Gramsci's use of subalternity or a restatement. Open Studies is using it as. Instead, I think we should just see Gramsci's work as this rich but mostly elusive and sometimes quite ambiguous conceptual apparatus that we want to just draw from and concretize in application. So in thinking through then how Gramsci's come up with his framing of subalternity, I think the key thing is that this isn't an abstract analytical project, but a concrete attempt by a political organizer to understand why these masses have been kept in historical subordination, why they failed to overthrow elite classes, and how then they could be organized to gain a sense of And if subaltern has a more specific application as the peasant masses as opposed to the industrial proletariat, then the question is how they can become a conscious class in themselves in order to ally with the proletariat in the north of Italy. Marxist norms, which often would see in orthodox Marxism the peasantry as an inherently counter-revolutionary class, as sort of inherently petty bourgeois. There are still inflections of the sort of more modernist project in Gramsci's understanding. So his basic problematic here, which is from the point of view of an organizer, but is still the somewhat teleological notion of a failed transition to a normative bourgeois nation state, which would then allow the potential for a sort of more normative organizing strategy. So if Gramsci's exploring the subalternity of the peasant masses with this failed transition in mind. But an interesting emphasis that Gramsci puts on this that allows a development beyond him is an idea of the autonomy of subaltern classes. So in his methodological criteria, he's asking us to explore the traces of potential autonomy and potential conscious political agency that are coming out of these different subaltern groups as they're being produced by the political and economic conditions of their own times and places, and producing sort of organizational forms that reflect those conditions. So the word that he uses in the methodological criteria, which were on the reading list, is parties, the parties of subaltern classes. I think we should see that sort of as a more general term for organization. And there are a few emphases that he lays on this. One is that these organizational forms are always going to be partial and fragmentary and incomplete and not going to be able to create what he terms integral autonomy. Now, integral autonomy is a sense of both their economic agency, emerging from their exploitation, as well as their potential political agency. And that touches with some of Gramsci's more general concerns about political as well as civil society and how they come together to form what he calls an integral state. So again, you have an integral state that's produced by hegemony and hegemonic classes and the potential integral autonomy of subaltern classes. But still within the limits of his own time, he sees this potential integral autonomy as always going to be limited until you can have a vanguard industrial proletariat in the north. So So he lays a lot of emphasis on the fragmentary nature of subaltern consciousness, the fact that they won't be able to, they'll only be able to press claims of a limited and partial character. And that basically they need this revolutionary leadership from the northern Italian proletariat. So I think the final thing I want to say specifically on Gramsci's view is that I would see classes are able to assert themselves against dominant classes. But in his taking seriously of their potential for having meaningful worldviews within their own culture, the general framework, as he puts it, for real political activity, there's a more libertarian, more bottom-up instinct which can be developed out of his own framings, and I think this quote, I think, sums it up. He says, there undoubtedly does exist a tendency to at least stages of unification in the historical activity of these groups, but this tendency is continually interrupted by the activity of the ruling groups themselves. So he sort of has this direction of bottom-up agency, but still pulls back to laying the emphasis on elites. Now, to turn then to subaltern studies started out of a very historically specific situation. This historically specific situation was an attempted revision of the historiography of Indian nationalism in the late 70s and the early 80s, taking influence actually from another group of historians, the Communist Party historians group, most of whom broke from the Communist Party in the 50s, but including Eric Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson and a number of other figures who influenced the New Left, who wrote what's called bottom-up history from below, or bottom-up history, which is just another word for saying sort of subaltern history. And they were very much reading Gramsci. And so this Indian school was looking to restore the sense of movement in India, which in their reading had focused far too much on bourgeois nationalist figures and the leaders of this movement like Gandhi, like Nehru, and saw subaltern action within this as largely derivative of these more, and so the emphasis was to assert even more so than Gramsci the autonomy of subaltern classes within this movement. And I think it's important to lay the emphasis here on the historical specificity of the subaltern studies project in the beginning, because of the way in which we've seen subaltern increasingly become this more general category for excluded groups. And I think that actually as studies developed, it's become a more and more historically specific category, but with less and less emphasis on this historical specificity. So I think just to emphasise, so there's a few quotes that I think emphasise or reveal rather both the emphasis on autonomy that early subaltern studies has, as well as the general, the still quite general application of the category. So both of these are from Guha, from his sort of manifesto of subaltern studies, which are these 14 points about properties, which are these 14 points about problems with the historiography of Indian nationalism, and he says the subaltern domain is autonomous, for it neither originated from elite politics nor did its existence depend on the latter. And so you're really setting an almost total autonomy. And then he says at the end of those 14 notes, a kind of note, the terms people and subaltern classes have been used as synonymous throughout this note. The social groups and elements included in this category reflect the demographic difference between the total Indian population and all those whom we've described Indian population and all those whom we've described as the elite. Some of these classes and groups, such as the rural gentry, impoverished landlords, and so on, who naturally ranked among the people and subaltern, could, under certain circumstances, act for the elite. An ambiguity which it is up to the historian to sort out on the basis of a close and judicious reading of the evidence. So you see there that that's a really, really broad category that actually encompasses the same sort of a wide spectrum of social relations that the most broad definitions of, say, working class have in Marxism, require us to sort of concretize more specifically the intersections and delineations within that. And the early part of subaltern studies remained this kind of heterodox Marxist discipline in very broad terms, but over the 80s, as the field became more self-conscious, internal critiques and delineations emerged, and also it started to reflect its own conjunction with this transition to different forms of post-Marxism, and particularly the introduction of Foucault and power-knowledge relations as a new problematic, which meant there was a sort of general exploitation and domination as the axial concept to one of marginality and the critique of grand narratives, so that by late subaltern studies it was no longer Indian elites or Indian historiography that was being critiqued so much as the way in which Enlightenment Western thought forms were historiography. And so there you get the shift to post-colonialism, and the key moment here is in 88 or 87 or 88, where you have this collection called Selected Subaltern Studies, which is introduced by Said. So there you have the sort of the birth of the two great axes of post-colonial thought with Said and subaltern studies. And as part of this, you get the person who's probably become most definitional of subaltern studies and the subaltern as a post-colonial understanding, who's Gayatri Spivak, and Spivak really articulates most clearly this new understanding of subalternity, as she puts it. It's being cut off from the lines of social mobility, or a part cut off from the whole. This other phrase she uses for it, which is subalternity, is where the lines of social mobility, being elsewhere, do not permit the formation of a recognizable basis of action. So I think that shows like how general now subalternity has become as a concept, just being cut off or marginal in some sense. It's lost a degree of specificity, and I think that's because this definition actually is even more historically specific, but it is no longer sort of recognizing that fact. What it's really looking to articulate now is a kind of non-inclusion in modernity that's come about in a number of post and neo-colonial societies, where the sort of say historical and cultural echoes of previous social forms have been reproduced in this uneven and combined manner, so that new subaltern classes who are maybe semi-proletarianized often have worldviews that are reproduced from preachers, and so there's an inability to really sort of fully participate in modernity, this being cut off from lines of mobility. And I think that's really shown by Spivak's assertion that it's an Indian industrial proletariat isn't necessarily subaltern as a factory worker if they're not cut off from these lines of participation in modernity, whereas agrarian masses who are still being exploited through, say, previous social forms that are being capitalized are subaltern. So that's sort of what I mean by how historically specific this has become. One thing I do think that's really interesting is reading the classic statement that pointed towards this now, can the subaltern speak? And I'd be interested to hear very shortly what your reflections were on that piece. But for me, what's really key is actually just how with quite high Marxist problematics. It starts off with a real defense of the idea of the idea of ideology in the reproduction of capitalism as a whole. It has a go at Deleuze and Foucault for collapsing and losing this problematic of ideology and their own role in that. And actually brings in the post-colonial example explicitly as a case study and almost apologizes for bringing it in those terms, which is interesting because if you read any take on it today, that whole introduction part doesn't really get spoken about. So I think I've definitely gone over the 15 minutes now, so I'll bring it to a close and just sort of gesture at Scott, who I think is a very interesting person to read in this context, because Scott has sort of stuck with a more Gramscian project in a lot of ways, looking at how political and economic configurations are producing new subaltern classes and taking the traces of their agencies very, very seriously in a number of different works, starting from The Moral Economy of the Peasant, which set out to show why classical economic understandings of rationality at play about maximized subsistence, and it did a kind of phenomenology of this political economy to show in what context subalterns would resist, and then after that did a number of studies, including the art of domination in the arts of resistance, which is on the reading list, trying to show how this not fragmentary in and of itself. It appears fragmentary to elites because of the ways in which subalterns have to perform when they're with elites versus how they reinforce their own worldviews when they're among themselves and providing the sort of ideological content for future revolts by talking among themselves. And Scott's particularly interesting because he's very much in dialogue with subaltern studies, as well as reading Gramsci, and as well as bringing a sort of healthy anarchist libertarian ethic to thinking about how resistance works in larger and smaller ways. And an interesting point there is that Scott actually does the foreword to Guha's masterpiece about peasant rebellions and revolts in India. So there are a bunch of questions which I put on the reading list, which we can explore. But I thought just to sum up, we can say that subaltern has two broad definitions: one categorical and one more specific and historical. One is just as any relation of subordination to a hegemonic order, and the second has become this more specific characteristic of being left behind by a non or partial inclusion in capitalist modernity. Broadly speaking, the former is more Gramscian, and the latter is subaltern studies, but there are lots of intersections between both of these. So subaltern history is attempting to write from this perspective of subaltern resistance. And so when we're trying to think about the methodology to apply this both to Byzantine studies and to our objects of study as Byzantinists, I think there's one thing that we can wonder about, like how Byzantium has been included and both excluded, because it's clearly a complicated double case. It is both orientalized and yet is normalized to a kind of medieval development, so it's both excluded initially. It's also more or less subsumed, so being excluded from, say, classics or from medieval studies, and being often shunted off into different departments, but it's also subsumed into the imperial structure of the humanities. So it's very rare if you'd ever find explicit Byzantinists as part of marginalized within history departments. And the other question is about how a focus on access, hegemonic translation, agency, definition, and methodology starts to reframe debates within Byzantine studies. And one of these, I think, that's most key is the debate over Roman identity in Byzantium, and then this question of the social scope of Roman identity. And the two poles here are kind of Yanis Storatis' line and Anthony Kaldelis's, and I think that both of these suffer from elitism. Kaldelis in generalizing the elite ideological discourse across subalterns by taking elite claims more or less for granted, and Storatis in emphasizing the sort of hermetic seal and the inability of subalterns to be more autonomous, to be more autonomous and to maybe even appropriate aspects of hegemonic ideology and turn them against themselves in the way that Scott picks up, say,